Just a quick one because it's related to the conversation today. But I wanted to share, if I can share my screen for a second, this site that we stood up last week around wildfire defense rebuilding support and recovery resources. Would love to share it with everyone in this call because what we're trying to do is support matchmaking around the green building effort. So if you or someone you know has a need, if you were unfortunately affected by the fires, which we know many people were, you're welcome to submit that need via a form we have linked here. Or if you have resources to provide, there's a form for that. And if you have expertise or knowledge you'd like to share from past fires, we were able to facilitate one-on-one conversations between experts and people who just were looking for information or advice. And it's really nice to be able to provide that because our community is full of experts. But when it's a low stress, low pressure environment, I think that's even better. After after devastation like this, you just, want support. So that's what we're trying to provide to our community. We'd love for you to share this with people if you know anyone in any of these categories. And then the other thing that I wanted to share is that we're hosting an event on January 29th for our broader community around rebuilding for a more sustainable and resilient future. And we'll put the link to that in the chat. It's free and it's 100% virtual. So we have architects, landscape architects, people who are experts in rebuilding who are coming to join the conversation. So we welcome you to join as well. I think those are the main two things. So I'll stop sharing my screen, but happy to answer questions on either of those in the chat or otherwise.
Well, thank you. And it just speaks to the volume of resources that are out there for victims of the most recent fires. And so part of the reason that we wanted to do this meeting was to try to focus a little bit of that energy to better understand what to pay attention to from a macro level. I see a lot of folks in here from all walks of life, from natural builders to realtors to engineers. And I'm assuming we have some folks affected directly by the fires here as well. So we will have a larger information sharing portion at the end of the call, as well as a long time for Q&A at the end of the call. So I want to make sure that we save time for that as well. Izumi, did you want to say anything else before we sort of roll into programming?
Well, just quickly, thank you so much, everyone, for showing up today. This is between Trent and I, we reached out to many other people who are usually not in this space, but I'm so glad to see you all. Normally, we would go around the room to, just especially for new people, introduce yourself. But since we have so much to cover today, I think we'll pass that. But if you are going to speak later, we will hopefully have some discussion time. Please make sure to introduce yourself and briefly tell us who you are. And I'm so glad to have Sam and Elizabeth today. So much for your time. Thank you for sharing your time today. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Izumi. So today we are welcoming Elizabeth Timme, the founder of Office, and Sam Carter, the founder of Resilient Cities Catalyst, to better understand what's happening now and hopefully what's likely to happen in the near and far future in the wake of the LA wildfires. Of course, nobody has a crystal ball, but let's try to do the best with what we have to try to look into a little bit of how to think better about this. Sam has worked with cities all over the world to prepare for and respond to climate disasters like Harvey, Katrina, and the Woolsey fires. And Elizabeth has spent her career pushing housing policy forward in LA specifically, from idealistic blueprint in her and her team's heads, all the way to homes on blocks all throughout LA County. We are going to kick off the conversation with Sam for a little bit more of a global perspective, and then we are going to move to Elizabeth for a more local perspective. And then at the end, we're all going to talk together amongst the sort of people who are leading the conversation, and then from you as well. If you do have any questions when we're in the sort of Elizabeth and Sam portions of the call, please put them in the chat or save them up for later in your own note-taking devices, and we can move from there. And I'm just full disclosure, very lucky to have had Sam and Elizabeth in my personal life for a very long time, and they're both amazing people personally. Okay. Sam, do you want to go ahead and sort of start rolling with your prezo?
Yeah, happy to.
Okay.
Let me see if this works. Can you see that?
Yes.
Is it full screen? And I can still see you guys, kinda. Hi, thanks, Trent, and thanks Izumi, and thanks Kim for hosting this conversation. Just a quick bit about me and my organization before I get into some of the content that Trent asked me to prepare. I'm the founder of this nonprofit, Resilient Cities Catalyst. We're in many ways a spin out or like an outgrowth from work and teams that I was a part of at the Rockefeller Foundation. So some of you may be familiar with a global program called 100 Resilient Cities. LA was one of those 100 cities. It was actually one of our real champions. I didn't work for 100 Resilient Cities. I worked for the Rockefeller Foundation, and I oversaw kind of the global resilience portfolio, which had me working in a lot of spaces, ideally ahead of disasters, but also after disasters. And for those of you who have been in this practice or in this space for a while, the kind of modern era of this work was very much defined by Katrina as kind of one kind of big event that kind of really shifted the practice, especially here in the United States, and really got people thinking bigger and differently about planning for these types of major events, which we know are going to be more frequent, more catastrophic. And Katrina's actually where I started doing this work. I was just out of grad school and got started on a research project of documenting displaced people from Hurricane Katrina. So people there was a diaspora, people kind of got sent, especially folks in public housing. And I was part of a research team that was trying to understand, where do these people go? And like, how are they kind of living their lives and getting resources, and what do they want? And I think the most remarkable, intangible, and visceral thing that I experienced, 20 plus years ago at this point, was that the kind of thirst to go home and that like deep desire to return to normalcy. And that's going to be a theme of something that I'm going to talk about today. And I think it's the most normal and natural thing in the world. And it's also one of the defining characteristics, I think, of resilient communities is that it's the people and the kind of communities and the social infrastructure in these places that really define it, as much as, if not more than, the built environment. I mean, they complement each other and they inform each other, but it's that kind of connection to place and identity that I think really forms the core of resilience from my perspective. But as an organization, as I said, we're a nonprofit. We work with cities and communities. We work with different types of government. We work with different types of municipal governments. Here in LA, we work with the county, we work with the city, we work with COGS, we work with the state. And we're trying to create cities and communities that are better equipped to manage the shocks and stresses of the future. And we envision a world where more people are, and particularly the most vulnerable, are better able to weather the turbulence that we know is coming. Because we know, absent intervention, it's every one of these events is just going to keep leading to more and more inequity and kind of eroding fundamental things in society. So we're working towards that. Just a little bit about our work in California. We have a big project in Goleta Slough, just up the coast in Santa Barbara. We're actually working with the Coastal Conservancy to do a whole prioritization of projects and get funding on the ground there. Here in LA, we just did a big strategy for the Baldwin Hills Conservancy. We did that with Climate Resolve. I'm at their office right now in downtown LA. Just if you're not aware, Baldwin Hills Conservancy is a really remarkable place. It's undergoing this massive transformation right now. This is just kind of an FYI. but they got a lot of funding earmarked in the climate bond, and they, I think, quadrupled in acreage that they're going, and they're going to be part of the kind of turnover of a lot of those brownfields and oil fields that are still active. And so there's actually this incredible urban project that's happening right in your backyard that I'm really excited about, and there's a lot of opportunity for experimentation and really awesome leaders over there at the agency that runs it. And then in Oceanside, down the coast, I designed and executed an international design competition called Rebeach, which was kind of a first of its kind in California. Look at how do you solve for resilience, erosion, and surfing all at the same time. And we worked with 3 different teams from around the world. The Australian firm ICM won. And now we're moving forward into implementation, like super rapidly. And if it's constructed, it'll be the first kind of major at scale artificial reef in the state, and I think actually in North America. And it's a reef that will kind of attenuate wave action, reduce erosion, reduce flood risk, and create new surfing. And we're actually working with surfers to model the waves and to design the reef. It's a really fun project. So check that out, rebeach.org. More work in California. But coming back to like some of the points I was making earlier, there's this term in social science called valence. Some of you might know it from high school science class. You know, in any atom, there are electrons as part of the system, and those electrons exist at different levels. Is this ringing any bells for folks that used to be young scientists in high school? It's a really interesting observation, and it was kind of a breakthrough in physics when we figured it out. You know, that like the electrons want to exist in a certain state, and it actually takes quite a bit of energy for electrons to kind of shift their orbit. And electrons kind of they're kind of hard to pin down, and they kind of jump around, but they always want to be in this kind of zone. And it's called their valence. And social scientists in the 60s and 70s basically stole this term and started using it to describe communities after a disaster and that desire to return to their home state. And so one of kind of the through lines of the sociology of disaster and the academic literature on this area is after every single disaster, there's this very real, palpable common thread of like, we want things to go back to normal. We want things to go back the way that they were. Because normal in people's minds is about my kids are going to school again. I can, take the same bus at the bus stop. My neighbors are still there. The community institutions there, the bodegas there, whatever it is, that's people's sense of self, and it's their sense of place, and their identity and their life is so bound up in that place, especially people who have been there for years and decades, for generations. That longing and desire to return home is a massive driver, at this early moment that we're in here in LA, when we're starting to contemplate what recovery might look like, and what these communities might look like in 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And I bring this up because I think in this work, and I've had the privilege of working with communities all over the world, and many here in the United States, in these moments of crisis and the kind of moment after an event. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that there's this inherent tension of, yes, we want things to go back, but things maybe weren't good or great, or there were parts of things that maybe could be changed. And certainly there was risk. I mean, given that there was an event that devastated these communities. So how do we have conversations? How do we have productive conversations about alternative trajectories or alternative pathways? And I hope we can get into that in some of the Q&A after we hear the 2 presentations. But I do not know how it's going to play out in Los Angeles. I don't know what the process is going to be. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not an Angelino. Is that what you say, Angelino, Trent? Is that a thing? Or that's
Yeah.
probably just something that people from outside of LA say.
No, you got that one
Um,
right, Sam. Roll
I
with
got
it.
that one right. But you know, I'm trying to share this stuff, and I'm sharing this kind of information with other folks around the city in these next couple of days, in the county and the state. And I'm hoping that the community can really lead a process that will open up spaces for alternative futures. But the kind of an immediate impulse of people is to kind of put things back the way they are, and that takes a certain amount of time, and you start the rebuilding. And if you read the executive orders from your governor, if you read the newspaper, that's a lot of the rhetoric is let's get rebuilt. We're not going to stand in the way. We're going to kind of revisit some of these environmental regulations. We're going to consider ways to, you heard it from the mayor last week, we're going to figure out ways to kind of streamline the permitting process, things like that. All totally appropriate and rational responses to this event. And there's a perception, and oftentimes it's a true perception, that building back differently might take more time, but you might have these different types of outcomes. For instance, if we build back differently in these communities, then we could shift the risk profile, which could make living and insurance cheaper or even if possible. Um, uh, but it's more complicated, right? It adds a lot of stuff to it. And so a lot of what my organization thinks about is, okay, how do you shorten that time? How do you kind of think about a process that might, tick some boxes and kind of get you to a different place and still kind of keep up with the pace of people's desires and demands? And then the really tricky part is who actually decides what different means. Like, what is that different trajectory? What does it mean to be in some other place? Like, and who gets to decide what that place looks like?
Communist.
So I think, so, there's this
Sorry.
question. No, it's fine. But so there's a question of like, what are we solving for? Is it just optimizing risk? I mean, if you want to optimize risk, you could just restore it to natural environment and walk away from the community. That would, I think, be an awful outcome for most of these places based on what I know about them. But that's one way to shift risk, is to change the exposure and to kind of move assets away. That's probably not what we want to do. And so what we're probably talking about is conversations about density, right? Here in LA, conversations about affordability, conversations about community cohesion, conversations about open space, the public realm more generally. What does it mean to have a commons in these neighborhoods? And all that takes time and effort and resources. And it can be really frustrating for people who want to go home. And so I just want to, there's no solution to this per se. I just want to put it out there as just an acknowledgement that there's this fundamental and inherent tension in these processes where there's a desire to move quickly and to restore back to where things were. And at the same time, there are going to be different things pushing for like bigger conversations and for thinking about possible futures. And I think as folks that are going to be involved in this process in various ways, whether it's just as a neighbor or like a member of the community of living in Los Angeles, or people that are more directly affected, holding that tension and being comfortable with that tension and acknowledging it, I actually think has power in and of itself. So just, not discounting people who want things to go back the way that they were, and not discounting that perspective, and also being open to alternative pathways as well, if that's not something you would otherwise be inclined to do. Economic vibrancy is another one. Just to kind of talk through, the other thing to think about is that the the recovery process isn't just driven by one single entity. There's like so many decisions that are going to get made. I don't know how many people on this call have been part of any kind of home construction project before. It seems like it's a mix of like designers, architects, but also potentially just homeowners. I've had the experience of building a house before and being part of enormous construction projects. There's so many more decisions than you could possibly imagine if you've never done it before. And then um, in the instances of homes, for most people, uh, you know, there's financing involved, and there's like financial institutions involved with home ownership. And so there's also conversations about insurance and banks and risk and that kind of stuff. And so in addition to the design team and the homeowner, there's a conversation that happens about, okay, where does this home fit within the context of a bigger risk profile? I want to say like a couple things just about the uniqueness of this event. This is the first major US urban fire and in kind of the modern era. And it's the first one that's so clearly articulated and tied to climate impacts, just such a unique set of events. I do believe that this event is going to have as much of an impact on policy in the field and kind of the practice as Sandy did in New York and as Katrina did in New Orleans. I think it's that scale of an event in people's public consciousness. It's global news. I don't know how much you guys realize that because you guys are here. But I had people from all over the world calling me because they know that I do work here and they know that I have family and friends here. And it was a very big story, and it's very much going to be driving conversations across sectors for a long time. And I bring that up because what happens here is really important, both from a global precedent thing, but there's also this unique characteristics of this fire where it impacted extremely wealthy individuals as well as more diverse neighborhoods. And so with this whole like property owner thing, there's this really kind of interesting dynamic that I think is going to play out here, which is there will be people with a lot of money and a lot of political power just jamming and putting all kinds of pressure on the system to rebuild as rapidly as possible, whatever they want. And I do think that's something for all of us just to keep an eye on. One of the things that I'm worried about is in this recovery process is that these communities could kind of be totally gobbled up and kind of taken over by wealthy individuals that have the means basically to self-insure. And what I mean by that is if there's another fire, they can rebuild, right? They don't need a mortgage. They don't need to deal with a bank. They don't need the bank to sign off on insurance. They're not worried about the insurability of whatever their new structure is. I mean, maybe they are, but they can take that risk in a way that other people can't. And if I kind of extrapolate out what might happen with this recovery, you can imagine a possible future where you have lots being combined, homes getting larger, people with means being able to build back, and actually exacerbating the income inequality and the kind of affordability crisis in these communities. So I just want to say from an outsider's perspective, I think that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. And I think there's a lot of reasons from a public good perspective why we'd want to keep an eye on that. Okay, on the community planning side, so all those individual homes exist within some conception of what that community is. And that looks different in different places. And there's different types of government entities that manage community plans. And in LA, it's a real hodgepodge, and you guys are well aware. Altadena is obviously county managed, and there's kind of the town council there. Malibu's a different thing. City of LA is a different thing. And so there's it's going to look different in different places, but most every place that has to rebuild has some type of a community plan, and they might be called different things. And after these events, there tends to be like a look back at those and an updating and kind of a thinking, okay, what do we want to be? And how does that work? Hopefully that process to update them is inclusive, and it's considered, and it's thinking about future climate risks, and it's thinking about that kind of collective action that can actually reduce individual risk and make communities more resilient. This is actually one of the issue areas that we hear from insurers that work on wildfire all the time. They don't know how to value or count community scale risk mitigation measures. And this is another thing, this kind of jumps into this kind of third piece of policy and funding. But there aren't established standards for community scale interventions and how they shift risk profiles. And so that's actually a big piece of work that needs to happen in the state of California, is to really define what is going to shift that risk profile. I know I'm running over, Trent. I just realized what time it was. But so on the policy and funding thing, there's a whole landscape of state level policies, local policies that are going to shape and inform kind of how the recovery takes place. Okay, I'm going to tell 3 quick stories and then we can circle back on all this stuff. So one is New Orleans. So this is the lower 9th ward. You guys probably, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there's some iconic imagery and some real awful scenarios in lower 9th ward in particular. You know, in classic American fashion, you know, you infill swamps and you kind of put houses on them, and then you put the most vulnerable populations there, and you move them there, and in some ways you kind of segregate them there. And then you build inadequate flood infrastructure, in this case, a kind of big wall and a levee. And it creates the conditions for catastrophe, and catastrophe is what happened in 2015 with Katrina. This is a picture from 2015. So this is 10 years after. And there's a couple things that I think are really interesting about this picture. There were so many rebuilding strategies and plans for lower 9th ward. It got a ton of philanthropic support. There were international design competitions. Was it the Brad Pitt house? I can't remember what the design competition was, but there was like a whole thing there. You'll see the houses that are rebuilt, a lot of them are elevated on here. They kind of have kind of upped their kind of base flood thing, and they restored this wall. But at the end of the day, it was kind of up to the individual homeowner. Are you going to come back? And you end up with a community like this, which is really, I think it's about, even today, it's about 30% of what it was in terms of the rebuilding. And there's all kinds of individual and collective decision-making that went into that. You know, do you want to move back to a risky place? Do you feel like you're safe there? Are there other places you want to live? People's lives change, et cetera. But, you know, this is one example of a neighborhood recovery, that there's still a vibrant community here. It's a wonderful place. I work closely with the local community-based organization. They're still doing great stuff, but it did not come back in a way that the community wanted it to. And they'd be the first to say that. And again, it's a great place, but the trajectory was very complicated. So one thing to think about. This is after Sandy. This is one of the big proposals that came through. There's another international design competition called Rebuild by Design. I was also a part of that. But this was the Lower East Side kind of city's plan to basically turn where the FDR, which is the kind of highway that goes around the bottom part of the city, into basically like defensible, safe by making floodable parks. So these are parks that are able to be flooded safely and actually retain water and keep water out from these communities. There's a lot of public housing projects behind this, and also just a lot of housing buildings. This is one of the lowest lying areas of Manhattan. And this is actually being built. So this is a picture from 2024. This is the kind of undergirding of the infrastructure that's happening there. And this is just to show like big projects can happen. Very interesting things can come out of these processes. And I think this is making this part of Manhattan a really incredible place, and opening up all kinds of access to green space and the water. This is another project. This is an offshore artificial reef built by the state and Scape Landscape Architecture and the Army Corps of Engineers. This is a oyster reefs that will actually grow over time with sea level rise. So the reefs accreate as the oysters continue to put their shells off. And this is actually attenuating wave action on the inside. It doesn't eliminate flooding, but it's actually allowed for some of the housing to come back on the inside because it's shifted the flood risk, and it's allowed some of these homes to get rebuilt. due to that shift in risk. So there's a play between infrastructure, public realm, and rebuilding houses. A lot there. We can talk about it in discussion. I just wanted to point to these two documents. If you haven't stumbled across the one on the left, I confirmed with my colleague earlier today. This is the active disaster recovery framework for the state of California. It's a big document. It's 250 pages. We can send a link out after the event. It's managed by OES. This is the playbook that the agencies are following. So if you want to understand what's coming, take a look at this. This will give you a sense of kind of what the plan is. Now, doesn't always stick to this. Things change. Your governor's running for president. You know, there's lots of things that could happen, but this is the official plan of what they want to happen. And then this other document is something that I worked on with, again, my friends here at Climate Resolve. This is lessons from the Woolsey fire, which was back in 2017, 2018. Affected some similar communities, similar findings, and it's actually very interesting to go back and look at now after this event. So I will stop there. Thanks for letting me go over. I apologize to the organizers, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sam. So much information, a lot to digest. We'll talk more about it in just a moment. But now I do want to hand things over to Elizabeth Timme, again, founder of Office of Office. Elizabeth, by way of introduction, can you tell us about the Rebuilding Response Initiative that you've just launched over the past couple of days, and anything else you want to say by way of introduction?
Sure. Let's see. I was gonna give you all a little frame of reference for our work, but I want to be able for us to have a talk. Let me see, I'm like reconfiguring my approach right now.
I owe you lunch, Elizabeth. I'm sorry. I took the time.
Okay, so what we did in the last week was basically put out what we thought was very innocuous, an invitation for BIPOC residents that had lost their homes to come to us, and we would offer free architecture, design, planning, permitting, and construction services. So that was something that we thought we would get, 5 homeowners or whatever, and we would be able to have very discrete impact. And we ended up having that result in hundreds of emails. 40 homeowners signed up. We're speaking with 20 tomorrow and 20 more on Monday. And we are now in the phase of kind of assembling what this looks like very broadly. But how we're thinking about this is starting to move beyond the explicitly architectural. We have a lot of partners that are starting to, we're starting to bring into a larger framework of a response. And we're thinking about how to contend with ongoing policy and advocacy, but pairing that with something like trauma support. We have members of our extended community and our close circle of friends that have lost before. I'm from Houston, so Harvey and Katrina are present in certainly my community, and we are aware of the landscape of bureaucracy and policy in the county of Los Angeles. And so we understand that there are real emotional parameters that need to be navigated in order for the rebuilding process to be done in a way that individuals have full awareness of what they're signing up for. But we also know that there needs to be policy and advocacy happening so that residents have the ability to make informed choices, have access to resources, and rebuild in a way that's reflective of how they were already living. So we have an awareness of the scale of the county. It's very interesting to say politically that the mayor, Karen Bass, has no jurisdiction over either of these areas for the most part. These are in unincorporated LA County, and this is the scale of that. We also know that as we get into these different pretty rote ways to respond, lockstep ways to respond to a disaster, that homeowners fall off. And thinking about a place like Altadena that was and is, I want to just like say current, present time is a Black thriving community. Um, that typically those are the homeowners that will be at greatest disadvantage to kind of carrying out and being able to have a long-term impact of returning to their home. And so for us, when we talk about sustainability, we're really right now focused on thinking about what that means to be able to stabilize a homeowner and give them as many rights as possible. And so we think about that being a kind of emotional and economic one. And as Trent and I prepped for this call, let's see, maybe I'll get to our slide around the public's right to space. We see that the ability to kind of link up where these resources are, where there are gaps in being able to serve a population that's most affected by inequities in the built environment. We see that, you know, studs burned, wood burned and steel melted. And so we see this as a natural disaster that's at a certain scale that obliterated a community of color. And we're very much focused on that specific population. And we understand that there are many populations that are vulnerable in this area. But for us as a 501c3 architecture and planning nonprofit, historically, we've done tens and dozens of projects in this way where we're really interested and focused on the multiplicities of ways that we can use planning and architecture and design to stabilize historically BIPOC populations in the city of Los Angeles. So that's us.
Thank you. Again, a lot going on there. I think one of the things that you have historically done in your work with first at LA Moss and then obviously at Office of Office is always grounded in building community in physical space. That's at least something that is transmitted to me through the work that you do. And so much of that physical space, whether they're places of worship or schools, libraries, and shops, are gone. And as you mentioned, very much obliterated. How do we center community members in our efforts to rebuild those physical spaces? And or is the solution something other than rebuilding physical spaces with community members directing what they do? We have these liminal spaces like Zoom where we can convene for a certain amount of time. But over the long term, what are a couple of things that folks on this call who have been affected or have ability to affect people who have been affected can do to center community in that rebuilding of the community spaces?
Is that directed at me or members of this call?
It is. This is you for another minutes directly, Elizabeth,
Okay.
and then we'll open it up to everybody. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, it's interesting because there's 60 years of community development practices that talk about inventorying community assets, being able to do ground truthing. And so there's a lot of work that's pretty, again, lockstep. But when we talk about these juggernauts of aid and the ways in which municipalities react to brokering resources, usually that's superseded by any community development efforts that might happen. And so we see ourselves, and we're going to be announcing a partnership with a national group that we see ourselves as advocates, intermediaries, and people that can kind of lift up and speak to the fact that there are these tried and true community building methods where we can work through what it will result in a building by using community development methods that center communities, center their resilience. We're talking about, you know, you look at the GoFundMe pages, and it's shocking to see networks like I would navigate, white privileged networks, $200,000 because their house is burned down, getting 300,000, and residents of color have on their GoFundMe page 30. And they're, you know, why is that? Is that because, you know, we could put a negative spin on that, but the reality that I've experienced from being an advocate and an ally is that it's because there's networks of resilience around free babysitting, around mutual aid, that we don't clarify. We aren't invited into those spaces as white elite. And those things are incredible. And so how are we not building? We should see that social sustainability as a value, and we should rebuild the built environment to nurture it. And so that's the kind of inventory process of how architects and planners can be of care and service, is that we advocate for those things that are invisible to us as privileged professionals, and kind of lift up the community stakeholders who are very aware and knowledgeable about what those things are. Does that make sense? It's ephemeral, but I'm hoping I can be as explicit as possible.
Yes, and thank you for being straight with all of us. We need that at this time. One last question from me, and then we'll throw it open to the wider group. So Sam obviously presented three particular scenarios of how responses have been in terms of a post-disaster landscape. I don't know a lot about how the Woolsey fire was reacted to, but as Sam also mentioned, this is the first major urban wildfire, the one that is also so directly tied to the effects of climate change. And so Elizabeth, like with the depth of your knowledge about how LA County operates, the speed, the machinations, the money, and the priorities, what can the folks who are here do to try to orient rebuilding efforts, resilience efforts, whatever happens next, more towards the direction of the community as opposed to the sort of, I'm not going to call it a nightmare scenario, but the scenario where those moneyed interests, large developers come in, ended up wresting control from the communities themselves. Is there anything in particular at an LA County level that folks can focus on to try to consolidate power within the community itself?
That's tough. Well, I think that what's really hard, if you're an educated professional, and I guess I'm speaking to that population because of this audience and this focus, but if you know someone who, and you know, Elliot is on this call also, so this might be better for Elliot to answer to. But I think if there's the ability to reach, if you have professional resources and you can be of service, reaching out and asking if there's community-based organizations and what the needs are, and not what your perceived notion of the needs are. And then being of service and standing in your power as a professional that does have the ability to offer something tangible, then you're using your power to support others to have a greater positionality. And so that what that would mean, and what that means for me personally, is that I'm offering this, and then now I'm seeing the need as a full program, and so we're building it. What that might mean for someone else who's an environmental advocate is that they reach out and they offer to write a draft for a community-based organization or a Black church to say, I'm helping you with your comms, and I'm providing you my intellectual resources on what the environmental impact is for you. Like, I'm happy to do that. Do you have anyone on your team that knows that? Would that be valuable? Or would it be good if I come to you and give a workshop right now for people in clean drinking water? So I think that thinking kind of granularly about what is your power and what have you built over the last 10 years plus for yourself to be of service, and how can you add it at this moment? And I wouldn't say like reach out and say how I can be of help, because if anyone's lost someone in our lives or had death in our lives or something really bad happening, people being like, I'm here to help you, let me know, is not helpful. So being specific and granular about what your skills are and what you would like to do. And we've had 10 people, we've had more than that, but 10 people specifically that I'm reaching out to in the last few days because they are professionals that have been that specific with me. So and again, I hope I'm being really granular with you about what that means. And I'm happy to answer questions later. My email is elizabeth@officeofoffice.com. So I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone interested.
Thank you so much. Questions. We have 12 more minutes, so let's just throw it open. If you want to raise your hand, type questions in the chat, or just open your mic. Go ahead. Elliot, I think you had a hand up.
Yeah, I think that right now, I don't have a background in all of your fields, but I have an interest in it, and it's really this information is really great. From a homeowner's perspective and sort of being activated by this to try to think about what the future will be like in the community. The hardest part to see is where to get the power. And I think continuing on what you were saying, Elizabeth, is like that. I think that's what we're trying to understand as a community is how to get enough power to be able to make meaningful changes. And it's really helpful to have allies in that. Most of my neighbors, a lot of them have been there 50 years or more. There's a lot of old folks. There's a lot of people who use no technology at all, cowboys, ranchers. There's, it's a very unusual community right there, and artists and hippies and, there's all kinds of people. And how to get enough power within the community that we can make some substantial changes that will make it resilient in the futures. I guess it's not a question, but if anybody has, we're taking any offers as we can. But I think there are many organizations that are sort of forming and helping, and it's hard to navigate, where to go with all of it.
Thanks, Elliot. I'm taking frantic notes.
We're recording this too, so.
Yeah, I think infrastructure stuff the power lines sparked on the transformer sparked in front of me. We have, how to get power lines buried. I have 2 properties before the national forest between me, but it's 80 acres. It's a couple very large properties that the fate of those properties affects all of the neighborhood that I'm sort of representing on the west side of Altadena, so there's a lot of this stuff that it's hard to see, like, how could we really affect that change? We need money, we need power, and that's seems to be the case, So.
Jonah, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jonah Reynolds. Been building sustainable off-grid buildings coming on to about 45 or so years. Maybe you guys have heard about earthships before, those weird tire buildings. Our solution that we'd like to submit, we've been doing disaster relief all over the world for decades, hurricanes, earthquakes, our buildings have been through them. We would like to offer solutions of 3D printing with concrete. We can print about 1,000 square feet in a week, completely off grid, no fossil fuels. They're very strong and very resilient, providing modern amenities. And of course, concrete is fire resistant. And they can take any form factor, any aesthetic, so the client has options, right? They're not going to be forced into a certain look or feel or anything. They get to have their cake and eat it too. And it's a conventional building because it's concrete and steel, which means existing building departments don't have to deal with anything new or weird. And so just to keep it brief, but I put a link to an article on our website. We would love to get out there and get moving. I really, really appreciate Elizabeth, your organization of doing, what you said about drawings and permits and that whole process. The idea of open sourcing these things is can really, really help. I want to be careful about focusing on the Palisades and focusing less on Pasadena. The eco building movement already has that stereotype of the kind of more affluent, wealthier side of things. So yeah, that's my offer. We would love to help, and we're here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonah. There is a whole other, at least hour, probably more like 12 hours of conversations of what is feasible in LA County. I know Jonah from Earthship World, and then tried to come home to LA and build an Earthship in LA, and it was a lot of no can do, and there is a lot of liminal space in between what is possible. You mentioned a concrete building that is permittable in LA. There are a lot of folks, I think I can mention Quail Springs Permaculture has a lot of experience doing this in Southern California. We had one of the former co-chairs of Quail Springs on last week to talk about her experience building with Cobb in Southern California. To me, as someone who is sort of engaged in the natural building and passive building world, it's really difficult to understand what's going to be possible at the budgets and timelines and building codes that are going to be allowed per insurance, county building code, and everything else. So I think, Jonah, like, this is an amazing resource. And I was just seeing a fire hose of information on what should be done for natural fire resistant building. I think there's a much larger conversation to be had about this, about how to focus that energy is another really important thing. Derek, or anybody else? I'm just sort of seeing who I see.
Yes, thanks for letting me speak. My name's Derek Ryder. I'm an architect at Homefront Build. We're a small design build firm in Cypress Park that does mostly remodel additions of historic homes and green building. And I was wanting to ask Sam a question and follow up to the point you made about the valence and the desire for communities to rebuild. In looking at a timeline that could be 6 to 7 years towards complete reconstruction, with a 6 to 9 month cleanup period and a 18-month permitting period and a 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 year construction period, if not 3 to 5 year construction period, is it potentially too great of a displacement for these communities, or is a community that is so well established and strong as this one, like these historic communities that you pointed to, like in the 9th Ward and such, likely to have that connection and that need to rebuild and have that ability to be patient? And then the second corollary to that is, what about the interrelated issue of the added pressure on the housing market of these displaced people in the interim? Because we have an incredible housing crisis in LA right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll take the second part first, and then I'll go to the first part. One of the reasons we did the lessons from the Woolsey fire report is because we wanted to understand if there was a more urban and direct impact event like the Camp Fire in Paradise that would happen in LA, would there be enough short-term housing to actually absorb the crisis in LA? Because what happened after Paradise was that people were camping in like Walmart parking lots for a long time, and like people ended up like it was a bad situation because there was no short-term housing, there was no hotel infrastructure, and it was a real crisis. Surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, one of the findings from Climate Resolve, our partner in that, was that there was enough, but only to do the short-term piece, not that kind of like medium term. And in this instance, it's like a multi-year rental market that can absorb these families that want to stay close. They want to stay close to their schools. They want to stay close to their community institutions that they're a part of. And so I don't know the answer to that. I have to imagine it's enough people, it's enough houses that it's going to shift the market in some way. But I don't have enough information to understand kind of where people are going to settle and look around, and folks like Elliot and Elizabeth are better positioned to kind of understand potentially some of the dynamics on the ground. Coming back to the first part, I have every indication based on the limited, conversations I've had over the last 10 days or so, that Altadena is this incredibly rich, like community that like has that drive and that like sense of purpose to come back. And there's so much energy there. I mean, we heard a little bit of it from Elliot's comments. But I've had a number of conversations with folks from there and from around there that kind of characterize the community as being incredibly strong. So that's there. The good news is, it's easier to stay in touch with people today because of technology and communications. So these communities can stay together and they can have that sense of identity even without some physical spaces. But I think, and this actually gets back to some of the earlier comments, one of the things I've been advising philanthropies and local governments here over the last few days is to look for where people are going organically, like what are the institutions they're creating, or how, like, what are the community groups that are forming that people trust, and fund them. Like, and coming back to your question, Elliot, like, where does the power come from? In all these disasters, there's going to be these organic groups that form. And the more governments can get comfortable supporting directly and working directly with these organic, nascent, new organizations, which is against government's DNA. Like, it's very hard to fund new organizations if you're a government. It's very hard to kind of partner with these groups. Being advocates for these organic groups to be the center of the conversation is really important. And Elliot, I do think that's a source of power going forward. If these organic spaces, these natural places where people are coming together, organizing, advocating, there's that work of self-organizing and becoming the champions for your community. And hopefully, they'll become more and more formal partners in the recovery process. And it's messy and complicated and people have different views, and but that's all part of the process. Hopefully that helps answer your question, Derek.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. This has been amazing. Before we all jump off, I want to just note I put a link to a document, a Google Doc, where you can add in your contact info if you'd like to be contacted about a follow-up of the recording and more information about the folks who spoke today, and or keep in touch with each other. It's there. I've also put Sam and Elizabeth's email addresses in there. Also look out at the USGBC California hub as well for more information all the time. Thank you so much. Super helpful. And I hope that this information can help everyone who's here to make the best and brightest version of your future life that you can possibly attain.
And let me just before we go, some of people already left, but if any of you is not on the hub for USGBC California, we have a hub where we can exchange information, communicate with each other. So I encourage you to jump on the hub. Kim is putting the link. I think you have to be a member of USGBC California, Kim. So if you're not a member, I encourage you to join. And this is a really wonderful organization that is doing a lot of great stuff for our community and now for California, entire California state. So let's use what we have, tools, and so we can support each other.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank you for
much.
being
Thank you, Elizabeth.
here.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.